Good evening and welcome to another weekly edition of Vatican Connections. I'm Noel Okel. Since our last episode, there's been a lot of interesting headlines coming from the Vatican, so here are just some of the stories that we bring you on tonight's show. The sacred stairs of the Santa Scala have been exposed for the first time in 300 years, and the team working on the project was completely amazed at what they found. The Pope spent all of last week in a Lenten retreat of fasting and prayer, and we have some behind-the-scene images from that event. The Pope's former right-hand man is sentenced to 6 years in prison, but will appeal, and we have some details about what his legal team will argue. And this week in the history of the Vatican, it was 20 years ago on March 17th that Vatican Radio and Sony Classics released the first ever papal music video. And I have all of that and more coming up on Vatican Connections up next, so be sure to stay tuned. Okay, let's begin today with a quick look at some of the recent papal events from the Vatican since our last episode, beginning with the Pope's message during his weekly Sunday Angelus address. From the balcony of his study overlooking St. Peter's Square, the Holy Father greeted the crowds on the second Sunday of Lent and reflected on the events of the Transfiguration. The Transfiguration of Christ, the Pope explained, shows us the Christian perspective of suffering. It is a necessary but transitionary passage. By showing his glory, the Pope noted, Jesus assures us that the cross, the trials, the difficulties with which we are suffering will all be overcome and resolved with Easter. Therefore, this Lent, he continued, let's also climb the mountain with Jesus. In what way? With prayer. Let's remain for a few moments in recollection, fix our inner gaze on his face, and let his light penetrate into us and radiate our lives. The Pope concluded his thoughts by saying that prayer in Christ and in the Holy Spirit transforms the person from within and can enlighten others and surround the world. Now, before the event ended, the Pope appealed for a renewed gesture of peace and prayer to combat hatred and violence following the March 15th massacre in New Zealand that saw 50 people slaughtered. A moment of silence for the victim was observed by the Pope and everyone at the square. Last week, the Pope celebrated the 6th year of his election as a 265th successor of St. Peter and the leader of the world's 1.3 billion Catholics. And how did he spend this anniversary, you wonder? Well, it's not what you think. The Holy Father spent it in a quiet week-long spiritual retreat in prayer and fasting to prepare for Easter. And I have some behind-the-scene images from that retreat for you now. Have a look. Now, since the beginning of his pontificate, the Pope made it a yearly tradition to bring the Vatican's leadership and his closest advisors with him to prepare for Easter. So most of his public activities and meetings were canceled until it concluded last Friday. But in the meantime, however, the interim director of the Holy See Press Office, Alessandro Gisotti, took the Pope's anniversary as an opportunity to speak to Vatican News about what he saw as the major themes of the Pope's pontificate over the past 6 years.
Pope Francis marks the 6th anniversary of his election to the See of Peter. The ad interim director of the Holy See Press Office, Alessandro Gisotti, reflects on a pontificate of love, mercy, and courage.
Thinking back to that evening of the 13th of March, 6 years ago, the first thing that comes to me was amazement, surprise. I think that the election of Jorge Mario Bergoglio was a complete surprise for all of us. I remember the expression of amazement when the Camerlengo announced the name of Bergoglio and Francis. Surprise because, of course, we know that the first Pope with the name of Francis, the first Jesuit, the first Latin American. What I want to underline now is that now that I have the privilege of being close to the Pope as a director ad interim of the Holy See Press Office, this Pope who came from the hands of the heart, as he immediately said during that wonderful and unforgettable night, I can say that what I experienced then, 6 years ago, was not just a passing emotion, because in this pontificate, I think that we are really witnessing God's surprises, and we are seeing these surprises specifically through the words and the words and the gestures of Pope Francis. For me, it's always a moving experience to see how close he is in the midst of the people. Really, in Panama was an incredible experience on this front. To see the joy, to see the emotion, people crying when encounter Pope Francis. His proximity, above all, to the poor, to the ill persons, to the weakest, is a manifestation, truly a manifestation of the love, of the mercy of Jesus, of God. And the people feel it. What impressed me, I was in the parish with him a few days ago in a Roman parish, how really the people, when you see how he's carefully listening what the Holy Father is saying, and how the people, especially the weakest, the poor, embrace Pope Francis, you really see in a touchable dimension, so concrete that they understand that Francis is truly a pastor with the smell of the sheep, as he said immediately in the first days of the pontificate, un pastore con l'odore delle pecore. Alongside this testimony of mercy, of love, what hits me is his courage. His courage to confront the most difficult issues, even if it costs for him, for the Church, but he keep on moving and confronting these challenges. What comes to mind is his commitment to dialogue for peace, and above all, his commitment to fight this terrible scourge of the sexual abuse of minors. This commitment, for me, is an example for all of us to confront without fear the most difficult challenges. So I think that these two words, love, mercy, and courage, are really the key words to understand this pontificate, even 6 years after the beginning with that unforgettable night.
Also, to commemorate the Pope's anniversary, the Bishops' Conference of his homeland of Argentina recently issued a statement saying that they'll officially ask the Pope to visit his homeland when they are in Rome next for their ad limina meetings this spring. The Pope, on many occasions, has expressed his love for his homeland, but has yet to make any plans to visit Argentina. Interestingly, this delay on his homecoming stands in stark contrast to his predecessors who visited their homelands within the first year of their elections. For example, St. John Paul visited Poland in 1979, about 8 months after his election to the papacy, while just 4 months after his election, Pope Benedict visited his homeland of Germany for World Youth Day in 2005. That being said, speculation was high in the early years of the Pope's pontificate that he would return to Argentina sometime in 2006, but he shot down those hopes in a message to his compatriots explaining that he would be unable to visit that or the following year due to other pastoral trips that have already been scheduled. The world is larger than Argentina, he said in a message on September 30th, 2016. I cannot be in two places at once, but I'll leave it to the Lord's hands to show me the date. So is a trip to Argentina in the Pope's near future? Well, I guess maybe we'll hear more about this in the spring. Here are some of the main headlines coming from Rome today. Last week, the former advisor to the Pope on economic matters, Cardinal George Pell, received his sentence for being found guilty by the Australian courts for abuse allegations that happened over 20 years ago. Here's the story.
Cardinal George Pell was sentenced to 6 years in prison March 13th, just over 2 weeks after a Melbourne court allowed the publication of news that he had been found guilty of sexually abusing 2 boys. In December, a jury had found him guilty on 5 charges, each of which carried a maximum jail term of 10 years. Judge Peter Kidd read out the sentence on live television. The judge would not allow Cardinal Pell to be filmed during the sentencing.
In my view, the first episode in the priest's sacristy involved a brazen and forcible sexual attack upon the 2 victims. The acts were sexually graphic. Both victims were visibly and audibly distressed during this offending. The obvious distress and objections of your victims is relevant to my assessment of the impact of your offending on J&R. There is an added layer of degradation and humiliation that each of your victims must have felt in knowing that their abuse had been witnessed by the other. You may have thought you could control the situation by reason of your authority as Archbishop, whether or not that belief was well-founded. Such a state of mind would have been extraordinarily arrogant, but the offending which the jury has found you have engaged in was, on any view, breathtakingly arrogant. You maintain your innocence in relation to this offending, which is your right, and as a consequence, there is no evidence of your remorse or contrition for me to act upon to reduce your sentence. This complexity is exemplified by the fact that on the one hand, I must punish and denounce you for this appalling offending. Yet on the other hand, I am conscious of the heavy reality that I am about to sentence you, a man of advanced years, who has led an otherwise blameless life, to a significant period of imprisonment, which will account for a good portion of the balance of your life.
Cardinal Pell, who continues to maintain his innocence, has launched an appeal, which will be heard in June.
Now, the court date of June 5th has been set to consider an appeal on 3 factors, one of which could actually overturn and expunge the cardinal's conviction and set him free. One ground for appeal is a complaint from the defense team. They'll argue that they were prohibited from presenting a visual aid which they claim would have shown that it was impossible for the alleged abuses to have taken place at the location specified. Another ground for the appeal is what is called a fundamental irregularity by the trial judge. The defense plans to argue that the judge intentionally ordered the cardinal not to be physically present in front of the jury when they entered his not guilty plea, since in the previous trials the cardinal was present during the plea and the jury was dismissed after being unable to reach a verdict. Now, if the appeal judge accepts any of these arguments as legitimate legal error, then the current verdict would be overturned and a new trial would be ordered. But as it stands, however, the cardinal will not be eligible for parole for the next 3 years and 8 months. And of course, we'll bring you more on this as the story progresses. Now, here's an interesting story. For the first time in 300 years, the actual marble steps of the Scala Sancta, brought to Rome by St. Helen from Jerusalem in 326, will be exposed and free from its protective wooden panels that were installed in 1723. Now, why is this interesting? Well, because according to Catholic tradition, Jesus himself walked on and bled on those marble steps en route to his trial before Pontius Pilate in Jerusalem. The team working on the restoration was absolutely amazed by what they found when they pulled back the old wooden panels. And for the next 40 days, the actual steps will be uncovered for the public to see them in its original state. And CNS brings you the story.
So we are now in the next to the last phase, I'd like to think the final phase of the conservation of the Holy Stairs, the Pontifical Sanctuary of the Holy Stairs. Today we were privileged to uncover the stairs themselves, revealing the original marble steps that St. Helen brought from Jerusalem in 326. Now these steps are, for centuries, have been covered with a walnut wood covering for protection, and also because it makes it easier to mount the stairs. But what we saw this morning are the grooves and the troughs and the usage of millions of faithful over the years from the 3rd century on. So as the wood was removed by the restorers, they were able to see this very unusual configuration of the original stairs, deeply grooved with troughs and showing this passage of millions of faithful through the centuries. They also discovered these medieval crosses, also with a grating effect that was protecting, according to legend, the traces of Christ's blood as he mounted to be judged by Pontius Pilate.
It's amazing. I mean, but just look at today, the troughs that are actually in the stone that was made by people climbing on their knees. It's all these hollows. It's very real, and it's how could you not feel something for that? As it's uncovered now, we can actually have the opportunity to see it and feel it.
This is a testament to the Passion of Christ. It's a theological message that teaches, but most of all, we restore the artistic patrimony and the historic patrimony of this site.
The soon-to-be cleaned-up steps and the restored frescoes along the stairway will be unveiled in April just before Holy Week. But until then, the marble steps will be left exposed in its original state for the public to see before the original wooden panels are put back on again for possibly the next 300 years. Lent is a reminder to stop, to return to the essentials, and fast from all that is distracting. It's a wake-up call for the spirit. If one member suffers, all members suffer together. 1 Corinthians 12:26. Okay, it's now been 3 weeks since the historic Vatican Summit on Child Protection ended last month. And with the most recent convictions of some high-ranking cardinals, people are wondering what, if anything, has come out of this unprecedented gathering of church leaders on the topic of sex abuse and its accountability thus far. Jesuit Father Hans Zollner, one of the organizers of the summit and the Vatican's leading expert on sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, spoke to Vatican News in a recent interview about what movements he's starting to see happen behind the scenes. And I have a portion of that interview for you now.
3 weeks ago, the big conference on child protection in the Church took place in the Vatican. What consequences have you observed since then?
I have read, I have heard, I have communicated with a number of bishops, participants who went back to their countries and of whom I hear that they have not only communicated about what happened to them and with them during those 3 days and a half, but who have also taken some initiatives, for example, in the revision of guidelines that they have initiated. They have spoken about a different way of cooperating with civil authorities. For example, a number of presidents of bishops' conferences have requested also the help of the Center for Child Protection of the Gregorian in the formation programs of church personnel on the ground. So there are many things that have come immediately as an output on the ground, and this is for me the most important outcome that I could have hoped for. That is that the presidents of bishops' conferences receive a message. The message was, do all what you can to do justice to victims, listen to victims, and do whatever you can so that safeguarding is implemented in your countries, in your dioceses, or in your religious congregations. This message has been received by many, and they have delivered the message back home. So this is what I could have hoped for, and I'm glad to see that those fruits are actually developing well.
And in terms of what's next, Father Zollner later in the interview said that we should shortly see the results on one of the projects promised by the Vatican, namely the handbook by the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith explaining step by step how bishops and religious superiors should handle abuse allegations and how they should prepare the relevant documents for the doctrinal congregation when an accusation is found to be credible. And finally tonight, we go back in time and look at one major historical event that happened this week at the Vatican. And it was exactly 20 years ago on Sunday that Vatican Radio and Sony Music Classical released the first ever papal music video starring no other than St. John Paul II himself. The song called Pater Noster, or Our Father, was part of the 11-track CD called Abba Pater, which was released just before Holy Week of that year to commemorate the upcoming Jubilee year in the 2000 and the recent 20th anniversary of Pope John Paul II's papacy. And I have the video for you now. Have a look.
Tu sei mio figlio, io oggi ti ho generato. Io gli sarò padre, egli mi sarà figlio. Sono parole profetiche, esse parlano di Dio che è Padre nel senso più alto e più autentico della parola. Dice Isaia, Signore, tu sei nostro Padre, noi siamo argilla e tu colui che ci dà forma. Tutti noi siamo opera delle tue mani. Sion ha detto, il Signore mi ha abbandonato, il Signore mi ha dimenticato. Si dimentica forse una donna del suo bambino? Anche se ci fosse una donna che si dimenticasse, io invece non ti abbandonerò mai. È significativo che nei brani del profeta Isaia la paternità di Dio si arricchisca di connotazioni che si ispirano alla maternità. Gesù annunzia molte volte la paternità di Dio nei riguardi degli uomini, riallacciandosi alle numerose espressioni contenute nell'Antico Testamento. Per Gesù Dio non è solamente il Padre di Israele, il Padre degli uomini, ma il Padre suo, il Padre mio.
Pater noster, qui es in cieli, sanctificetur nomen tuum, adveniat regnum tuum, fiat voluntas tua, sicur in cielo ed in terra. Pane nostrum quotidianum da nobis hodie, et dimitte nobis levita nostra, sicur et nostri victimus, debitoribus nostri, et ne nos induca in tentatione, sed libera nos a malo.
And that's our show for the week. Now, if you'd like to have any questions answered on the show, drop us a line on the Salt and Light book Facebook page or on my Twitter handle listed below. I'm Noel Okel. Thank you for joining us, and we will see you again next week here on Vatican Connections.